Hey, welcome back to the Dicenius Review. This is a podcast that we talk about art, literature, culture, books, movies, anything we want to. And we are primarily housed on, or homed or unhomed on Substack, but you can listen to us anywhere. You can listen to podcasts at from Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, or any of the podcast streaming apps available. All you have to do is go on Substack and copy the RSS link. Well, it's another day, another podcast. Been knocking out a lot lately, and it's really awesome having great guests almost every single night. And today I wanted to talk about specifically, I wanted to start off my conversation about the internet, specifically Substack itself. And I've been on Substack for almost 3 years now. I think it was 2019 or 2020 when I first came across Substack. It was somebody shared a posted an article, and when I discovered Substack, I was very impressed. I was like, okay, this is cool. This is a place where instead of the usual social media kind of quick takes or hot takes or extra dose of nihilism or stupidity, we have long form articles. And I immediately decided to hop on, and I kind of migrated most of my old WordPress website onto here. And it created a small little community where people discussed all sorts of intellectual, interesting topics, stuff from simple reviews of, kids movies all the way to Oswald Spengler and The Dark Enlightenment and all the cool stuff that we tend to all be into. And what made me happy in the early days is that more and more of the people I followed on YouTube or on Twitter or wherever joined up. And it really was a very tight-knit early community that kind of attracted a high quality of writer and poster from fiction to nonfiction. Of course, with all growing things, Substack decided to start adding notes. And at first I was very skeptical of notes. I was like, oh, I hate this. I don't want to turn to Twitter. I deleted my Twitter, which I had a few thousand followers. I was never a hardcore Twitter guy, but I did have a large amount of followers, and I convinced most of them, a lot of them, to switch over to Substack. But notes, started off as another kind of X or Twitter type thing where people just vomit out their words. And my big fear with notes was not that, it was that it would start bringing the hot takes type of conversation. And I'm guilty of it. I sometimes I'm sitting at work and I'm bored in between tasks, and I pop on my phone and I just shoot off some hot take or call somebody a retard or whatever. And it's a failing of mine I have. I have a hard time resisting that lure of the instant dopamine that the Twitter world kind of gives you. So now we have that, in Substack, in our Substack garden. But that wasn't all that bad, mostly because through the notes, I met people like, Fisto, my always online, awesome co-host and frequent guest. And that's why I met Lisa Kuznak and our current guest all through the notes feature of Substack. So there are some positives to it. But in the last few weeks, I've noticed that the quality of Substack has started to really degrade. Things that we've never seen on Substack, things that belong on Facebook or on Twitter have exploded on the scene. Low information posts, a lot of insults where everything's a Nazi or a fascist or, Mussolini or whatever. It just kind of silly, dumb, rhetorical, Marvel brain level kind of conversation where, 2 years ago, you'd see a mention of Mussolini and you'd have an in-depth, post about, his fascism in Italy and post-fascist Italy and communism in Italy and all the futurism and everything that goes around that era. Now you have just people calling, well, you're a fascist, and not only that, but I think I've been insulted on Substack in the last 2 weeks. I've been called everything from a far left guy to a far right guy. And it's becoming frustrating. I think I've blocked more people in the last 48 hours than I have in my entire lifetime of blocking people on the internet, which says a lot. And the reason I'm doing that is because I really want to kind of hold up the integrity of the place. I want to be able to, open up whether it's on my PC or on my phone and look at it and, get a, a great interesting read, a good interesting conversation. And I don't need the Twitter insulting nihilism or the Facebook like boomer grandma political takes, and they're just boring. They're ultimately uninteresting and played out, and they really belong in a different era that I'm hoping we put behind us. But for all my doom or gloomerism, Substack is still great, and what makes it great is awesome writers of fiction and nonfiction, and one of them is Dr. Monzo, Mr. Mason Mohan, who is our guest today. What's up, man? How are you doing?
Hey, glad to be on here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while now, and when we scheduled it, I was like, okay, I'm going to set it for a day where I have the time to really think about what I want to talk about and really catch up on a lot of the stuff you write on your Substack. So, welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks. Yeah, I write about a lot of stuff. I can't really pin down one area of interest, so it ends up whatever I think is interesting at that time, I end up writing about. I scheduled out two posts for the first week of November today that both go in extremely different directions. Totally different subject matter. One's about Plato, and one of the dialogues. I won't spoil which one. So you want to be subscribed to see that. And the other one's about like the genealogy of communism, or like the pre-genealogy of communism, like two totally different topics. And this is coming right after, I've been doing a lot of media theory stuff, like, commentary on the internet. And it's whatever I think is interesting at the time, I'll write about. And usually I'll write a couple things on any given subject, but it changes up quickly. So you're getting a nice variety when you subscribe to me.
Well, that's and that's why I really enjoy reading your work. And for the guys listening at home that are not familiar with Mr. Mohan, Mr. Dr. Monzo, I'm just going to call you Dr. Monzo, and because it's easy, and that's what your name is on Substack.
Yeah.
You can tell me what that means if you want.
Yeah, well, it's like it's like a half pseudonym because I was Mason Mohan before. Um, excuse me. But if you see my URL, it was drmonzo.substack.com, and my username was at Dr. Monzo. So it's been kind of an on and off semi pseudonym for years now. And I don't actually remember where it came from, if I gave it to myself or somebody gave it to me, but it's inspired by Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Right, like
Uh,
the Dr.
Dr. Gonzo, yeah.
Dr. Gonzo, yeah.
But the letter is switched out to my initial.
Right.
So
That makes sense because I actually thought I was thinking about, Dr. Gonzo and Gonzo journalism, and that's kind of what I was hoping it was, and I'm glad it is. But
yep.
for the guys listening at home, if you're not familiar, which I'm pretty sure most of my listeners are familiar with your Substack already. I know Fisto, who sends his regards and is not able to be here because he's too good for us or something. He sends his regards, but he was looking forward to being on today, but he got caught up at work. But your podcast is not your podcast. I'm sorry. Your Substack is named after the hour of decision, and it's drmonzo.substack.com. I'm going to link it on the post of this actual podcast episode, but just in case, it's filled with fascinating stuff, and it's definitely exactly the kind of post that kept me and brought me to Substack and kept me in Substack. Basically, long form, very intelligent, very well written, very displaying your erudition and your thought that it goes beyond the usual kind of shit postery you see either on X or any of the other kind of websites. But yeah, so what inspired you to start a Substack and write and that whole thing?
Well, I've been writing for as long as I can remember. It's kind of a impulse, like deepest impulse, like from my soul, that I just have to write. And if there's periods in my life where I'm not writing, I feel sick with myself. I just have to get something out there. Which I don't really know the source of that, but it's this desperation to keep writing things, keep putting thoughts together. So I've been doing that for a while. I've been putting out written content on the internet since maybe like 2017, back in my libertarian days. And I was doing a lot of stuff in the libertarian sphere, We had there was a website called 71 Republic, and it was a libertarian news website, and I was one of the guys that started that, and we were just putting out writing left and right. And then that took a break for a while I focused on academics. But now that I'm all done with academics, you know, when you get out into the professional career world, unless you're a professional writer, which is a very hard thing to be, you're not going to usually be writing in your everyday life. And I couldn't have that. I was like, I gotta keep writing. And the way I actually started it was the title is After the Hour of Decision. And I was thinking, okay, I'm reading these books, and because I've always been a big reader too. I love to read.
Right.
And if you follow me on Notes, every Saturday I post a stack of books that I'm choosing between, and it's a GM time to read, or if it's the afternoon GA time to read. I'm trying to do that excuse me, every Saturday just to show people what I'm into that weekend. But
Right.
it started because I was reading, or I wanted to read After the Hour of Decision. I've read most of Spangler's other works, but I wanted to read this one, and I wanted to make sure I really understood it. So as I was reading it, I was just sitting down, taking extensive notes on everything, and the notes would kind of trail off sometimes because something he would say would remind me of something else, or I would think of some application that's much more recent than when he was writing, or evaluating his predictions, seeing if his predictions were right or wrong, or semi-right. And over the course of doing those notes, I was thinking, hey, I could turn these into some essays. So my Substack started with a 14-part series on Spangler, The Hour of Decision, which in retrospect, that's kind of excessive to do 14 parts on a 100-page book, but it is what it is. And then I did the same with Mana Technics, but over the course of that, I started writing about other stuff too. Um, and a lot of it is kind of the same process of I'm reading and there's something I think is really interesting, and I'm like, oh, this makes me think of this. This makes me want to, I want to expand on this idea, or this idea reminds me of another idea that I want to connect it to. And so I'll take a bunch of notes, I'll kind of flesh it out, and then I'll start adding my own analysis and what I think about it, and examples. And like my most recent piece was it was on Hank Schrader from Breaking Bad, and analyzing his arc through Schopenhauer's understanding of the tragic hero and tragic narratives. So, sometimes fun stuff like that. Other times it's totally off in the weeds where, okay, we're going to look at everything I can possibly get my hands on about, the pros and cons of population decline. And then I'm going to crank out a giant essay about that.
Right, right. And I mean, what's really interesting, and I think a lot of us come from the same kind of place where, we grew up being the kind of guys that read a lot. I like I've said in different episodes where I started reading, I think, heavily when I was 4 years old, when I read my first novel, and I've read nonstop. Well, I tend to be more of a literary reader, and I tend to focus more on like a kind of mysticism and that kind of stuff when it comes to nonfiction. I do really enjoy a lot of political science or economic science, and a lot of philosophy, even though I'm not as well read as probably you when it comes to philosophy, but I find it fascinating. But what I have the urge to, one, when writing about it, and maybe you can agree with me on this one, by writing about it, you sort of internalize it and analyze it through your own lens, and then you absorb it better. It's kind of like I'll read something, I'll read, I don't know, Christopher Lasch. It's on my mind right now because I'm in a book club where they're reading Christopher Lasch's Culture of Narcissism. And I think about it and I write down notes, and I'll write an essay on it because it makes me kind of like helps me analyze my own thoughts on the process, even so it's mostly for myself. That's kind of a personal element. But the other element is that there's a yearning, I think, of going somewhere, sitting down with a bunch of people and talking about, what you just read. Like, hey man, I read this. And for a lot of us, that's a hard thing to find, whether it's because we don't have friends next to us, or most of our intellectual friends are on the internet, really, as opposed to being in person. And I mean, so that's one of the main attractions to Substack and podcasts, really, is that I can sit down and talk about the kind of stuff that most of my friends who are great people, but maybe not as well read or not as interested in these topics, we can talk about this kind of stuff that unless you're in a deeply academic kind of environment, you don't really get the opportunity to talk about it as much.
Right. And
Right?
even then in the deeply academic environment, the fences around you, there's people that you just can't talk about.
Right. Absolutely. Because some of the stuff is on the other side of the fence, basically, you know?
Hmm.
And I, well, I was fortunate enough when I was living in Los Angeles of living real close to my friend Chris, who was he was a guest on this podcast many episodes ago, and he's a guy that's heavily into philosophy, and he's kind of my I defer to you when I have a question about philosophy. Or when I'm reading something and I'm just like, it's a little bit behind above my head. Chris, tell me about this Heidegger guy, or
Yeah.
what's this Dason about, and he's much more well read because that's more his focus. And he'll hit me up if he has a question about Tolstoy or something. But I think that is the beauty of the kind of the internet situation, and kind of the downside in a way, because I've noticed over the years, and I don't know if this applies to you at all, or maybe to listeners that are listening, that I have compartmentalized, or God, man, I'm tired, my friend circles to the point where I have real life normie friends and people I go to parties with or have dinner with and that type of thing. And then I have my internet friends or acquaintances, my pen pals, basically. And with these guys, I feel more of a connection with intellectually because we share a lot of the same books and the same philosophers and the same ideas. And we can throw back and get into real in-depth conversation that I can't really have with my real life meat space friends or whatever you would like to call it. And is that a dangerous thing? And you do, I think you mentioned this in one of your essays, about one of your internet essays, the one that talks about liminal spaces and that type of thing,
Hmm.
where they discuss like friends disappearing or people you've talked to. And is that a risk? Is there a lack of solidity to those kind of relationships? And then maybe that's one of the reasons I decided to start this podcast, because it does add an extra layer of reality to the situation, and for all the guests I've had on this podcast, I do this one thing where I always turn on my camera and I'm like, hey, what's up? I'm a real human being. It's like my AI check, basically,
Yeah.
and I do that because I do want a level of I would say maybe intimacy that is different than a Telegram chat, even though some of the best conversations I've ever had in my life have been in Telegram chats. But what do you think about that? Do you have a lot of personal friends you do a lot of one-on-one conversations with, or is it mostly online when it comes to breaching these topics?
Yeah, so I'm pretty fortunate just to have a lot of people that I know from school, from college, that, everybody's kind of spread out across the country now, but
Right.
some people still live somewhat close to me, close enough to where, oh, we can get a drink, or, oh, it'd just be like a 3 hour drive, maybe up to 2 dozen. That might be excessive, but at least like a dozen people that I could have this exact kind of conversation with. Most of whom I see frequently enough but it doesn't quite scratch that itch. That's why we still got to do the, stuff like this, talking on podcasts. But one thing it kind of made me think of is it's very tempting to say that, oh, if we didn't have this podcast space, then we wouldn't be able to talk about these things with people at all. And we'd just be stuck with people who are less intellectually curious. But there's plenty of smart people out there who just aren't interested in these ideas.
Right. No, I
Um,
agree. I agree with that.
and but it's kind of like a Bastiat, the economist that libertarians love. He talks about the seen and the unseen. There's the opportunity cost, and that's what you don't see. And so what we're not seeing is like the entire alternative scenario here, where if there was not the internet at all, and if there were not these spaces, then you think about what coffee houses used to be, where they used to be areas for gentlemen to get together and discuss grand ideas. We learn about that in history classes, and that's uh, probably mostly outside of living memory now, where having these associations where you can get together and discuss literature and stuff like that. And there's a few people trying to do that again. either through coffee shops or cigar lounges,
Right.
places where people can get together to discuss literature. Uh, eh, well, and there's actually probably a lot of those, but they're going to be overrun by libtards, essentially, purple-haired people that, if you go to any sort of like literature area, like, these hipsterish bookstores that have, book presentations and stuff where you can talk to people, it's all pretty liberal people. So
Right. Not
generally,
welcome.
yeah, generally dissident literature is not, it's hard for it to get a space in real life, which that's for a lot of reasons. But I do think that if we didn't have the internet, in general, I think that the atomization would be less, which means that the intellectually curious people would seek each other out in person. And there probably are people, because like, I mean, there's not a ton of like anons and like people that are kind of dissident thinking out there, but there's enough to where you probably, like you, anybody listening, probably live within close proximity to at least a couple of them. They're just really, really hard to find, because
Right,
nobody
right,
talks
absolutely,
themselves.
absolutely. So, I'm glad you brought up coffee shops, and I've talked about coffee shops on this podcast for a long time because that's kind of the idea of this entire podcast, and the reason is because I grew up in Long Beach, California, which is a city. It's like a parasitical city on Los Angeles. It's one of those, big cities next to another bigger city, right? It's like it's hard to tell the difference between where Long Beach stops and Los Angeles begins. And I grew up in a very middle class, semi-urban area. I think the better way to kind of describe it. And there was always coffee shops. And growing up in the late 90s, coming of age in the early 2000s, this was like at the height of that indie coffee shop kind of era before Starbucks destroyed them. And, some of my best memories involve coffee shops, really from the age of maybe like 14 to really, I would say 27, 28, or even older. I spent every day at a coffee shop. There was this wonderful coffee shop called Mother Mudd's, which was started by a great dude who's a musician in an Irish punk band. And he ended up selling it because he got a real job. But later, but it was a place where every single night we would go there and we would all sit around a table outside, smoke cigarettes, and the place closed at 10 o'clock. But every single night, whoever was working that night would make a fresh pot of coffee and leave it out for everybody free. We'd all just drink coffee. And sometimes we would sit there until 2, 3 in the morning and just have conversations. And most of the people that were hanging out there were guys that were students at Cal State Long Beach, guys studying history or anthropology or all manner of subjects. And we would sit there and we would talk about everything from politics and the latest movies. We would have these conversations there. And one of the things that was fantastic about it, and a thing that is, I feel like, kind of missing in our world right now, or somewhat maybe diminished, is that there was a very there was a mix of age groups, right? There was a few of us that were in our early 20s, and then there was a few of the people there that were in their 30s, and a few even in their 40s, getting ready for retirement. And we would get this huge mix of younger and older people, and would get all kinds of like kind of critical life information from the older people, and then we'd then turn around and introduce it to the younger newcomers that joined the group. And it was such a wonderful kind of experience, and moving away from that really, really sucks. And I blame, in a way, I blame Starbucks for this, because there's so many great coffee shops got surrounded by strategically placed economic bombs of Starbucks that destroy these places. And Starbucks would, people aren't familiar with this, but Starbucks would do this thing where they would find a neighborhood with a small coffee shop, and they would put 2 or 3 Starbucks in like a triangulation of that business and destroy it, and then they would close the Starbucks, right? And we've lost that kind of environment. Now there are lots of like independent little coffee shops around, but unfortunately they have kind of become I would say maybe with the kind of the collapse of the alternative culture, where alternative culture used to be somewhat, I would say, edgy or intellectually open-minded, into a kind of a alt puritanism is what a lot of the culture has become.
Mhm.
you're right. They are dominated by that kind of thing, you know, by the kind of closed-minded, clicky, you know, non debating, non thinking people. And you know, you said you used to be a libertarian, or you came from a libertarian background. I came from a very left wing liberal background. I think that you could safely say that 20 years ago, when I was a 20-year old, I would have been a you know a left wing guy, kind of a left wing extremist. But I never fit into the stereotype, or I never really adopted the identity type of issues that the modern left wing does. That's kind of what turned me off. And you know, my journey through it is long and complicated, and involves, you know, a trip to Afghanistan and all sorts of reevaluations. But one thing I've always missed is I never went from the left to conservatism or normie conservatism. I went from the left to, you know, alternative rightism. Basically,
Yeah.
I skipped the Mitt Romney, George Bush era completely, you know, and I still hate those guys equally as I did when I was a liberal.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. There is an opportunity cost of this internet. And what I think we might lose is that when there is no internet outlet, when there is no, you know, podcasting outlet, or these conversation outlets, I think we are forced to take on a more kind of a mentorship role. And you know, I try my best to do it. I'm not really great at it, but I do. I tend to prefer to hang out with people younger than me, because I find the Gen Z a lot more interesting than I find my own elder millennial crowd, who tend to be kind of stilted in their thinking, and cannot really think outside that old um, paradigm of post boomerism. And I do have a lot of friends in their early 20s. And one of my proudest moments, right? And this is a good one, is people that do listen to my podcast, but they don't talk to me about it, because they listen to it like independently of me. They know it's me, but you know, they don't do it. And I had coffee with an acquaintance of mine, a guy, you know, he invited me to a church, and I went to check it out and everything. And afterwards, he sends me a text, and he's like, "Hey man, have you ever heard of this like Evola guy?" I was like reading his stuff, and I was like, yo, bro, let's take it down a notch, okay? You know,
Yeah.
let's you know, let's talk about this one in person, not over the phone. Or another great example, I'm sure you're familiar with John Carter of Mars on
Oh
Substack.
yeah, he's great.
I walked into a room at work completely like, not, I mean, I work in a very normie kind of environment, right? But there is a lot of young people that I work with, all, you know, well-educated individuals. And I walked into a room, and there was two guys sitting at a computer, kind of like, you know, shooting the shit, killing time. And I looked at the computer screen, and these guys had one of his articles open, right? It was
Yeah.
actually the one about women, or the 60% female thing with the education thing. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, well, and they're like, oh, do you know this guy? I'm like, no, I have no idea who he is. Never known.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I have no idea who he is. Yeah, of course I know this guy, you
Yeah,
know?
but the Substack space is not that big, so it's like you're like, yeah, I know him. They're probably gonna
Right.
find you.
Right. I'm like, oh, yeah, I know him. He's going to fucking be on my podcast eventually. I've been saving him for a while, you know?
That'll be a
Um,
good one. Yeah.
and you know, it's like I talk to him in group chats and stuff all the time. But yeah, I mean, so sometimes it makes me think like I don't want to completely hide in the cave of the digital and only have a digital world. I think that it is important for us to put forth some of these ideas in a maybe sanitized, or kind of, you know, how do you go about it, right? Do you just walk up to somebody and you're like, hey, let me tell you about the Dark Enlightenment in Nick Land. Here's you know, mention Molbug's book, you know, or something like that, right? Or here's some Spengler. It's not going to work, right? It's something that like you can't go to that level from where your average person is, you
Right.
know?
Yeah, but it
How do you approach that?
yeah, well, I mean, somebody's got to be curious in the first place if they want to find out about these things, and if they
Right.
do seem like a genuinely curious person and you like befriend them, you can kind of share little by little what you've been reading and what you're interested in. I remember this was hilarious. I was back visiting my hometown, um, and like where I grew up and stuff. And I was out at it's kind of this like hipstery coffee shop slash bakery place with mostly outdoor seating. And I was there with my mom, but as we were leaving, um, I noticed that there's this Zoomer guy about my age, it seemed, across the way reading The Beau and the Club by Evola, and I was like, no way, dude.
In public, bro? What are you doing, man?
Yeah, the thing about that is like if the average libtard is not going to know who Evola
No,
is or who
right.
Spangler is. So it's like you can pretty safely do that in public. You can like I'll read just about anything I own in public. But I walked up to him and I was like, "Hey, like is that book good? I have a copy of it, but I haven't started it yet." And he looked like he was about to like have a heart attack.
He's,
It's
he's he's getting ready to fight. This
yeah,
guy's
it's
like, oh
just
my God, is this guy gonna fight me or what?
yeah, no, it's just like, oh, nice. Yeah, I'm planning on reading that soon. Devil is cool. I like some of his stuff. And he was like, oh, nice. And then, just kind of walked off. But I thought that was hilarious. Um, but yeah, I mean, your question though, kind of, how do you talk about that with people? I mean, somebody's got to be in the right space and just be the right kind of person that even wants to talk about that. Because, I have lots of, in person, not online friends that are not at all interested in this stuff. And like, even if I did introduce some of it to them, they'd be kind of like, okay, that's cool, I guess. That's nice that you're into that. Like, but somebody that's really into it is going to have to, be reading the literature, so to speak,
Right.
to have these kind of conversations, or at least be pretty familiar with a lot of the ideas. And you can't really like force feed that to somebody. It's got to be somebody that's interested in it on their own.
It's ultimately the liberal the hyper liberal communist revolutionary dilemma. It's like, why won't these dumb peasants understand that I'm trying to help them by destroying their churches? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In a way, what because a lot of this stuff we talk about, and because I think we become so seeped in it in our internet world and even in our personal spaces by reading it, and interacting with it, we forget that we live in a the majority of people, 80, 90% of the people are comfortable and, cozy in their kind of bubble. And it's a good thing. We don't want them riled up. You don't want everybody thinking about this shit all the time, right? Because that would be a really neurotic, scary world. And when you bring somebody, whether into the far left or the far right, or any of these kind of ideas, or even into some the philosophical ideas, we do kind of ruin we bring a child, you tell them Santa Claus isn't real, basically, when
Right.
when you even tell somebody in a jokeful way, oh, democracy is fake and gay, to quote the meme, right?
Hmm.
You're telling them Santa's not real, man, and that can be traumatic for some people, and it could actually have the opposite effect. It could stir them towards the completely opposite direction that you intended to. So in a way, I guess we get to play with codes and smile and nods and that kind of stuff. But yeah, man. So, philosophy seems to be a topic that interests you a lot, and you do mention a lot of the philosophers, a lot of like Baudrillard a lot, which is kind of our guy, not our guy type of thing on here, and
Yeah.
he's interesting, and of course Nick Land. Have you ever read any of Nick Land's stuff other than Dark Enlightenment, like Fang Numina or anything like that?
Well, I actually I pre-ordered Xenosystems, the new Passage Press collection of a lot of his work, and that just came out
Right, I haven't
maybe
gotten
a
that
month and a
yet.
half ago. Yeah, it's fantastic. So I read through all of that, and it was so good. It's a lot of because that's very much so his post the Dark Enlightenment era writings.
Hmm.
And when he's in our milieu, so he's elaborating on a lot of ideas from the Dark Enlightenment, as well as lots of other ideas, and bringing back some of his old stuff to touch on that. I haven't read a ton of his old stuff. I have Fang Numina up on my shelf, but I'm not gonna just dive into it without making sure I kind of have a grasp on Deleuze and Kant first, because
Right,
otherwise I might feel
and
kind of lost.
so I have a kind of a funny story about Fang Numina and actually Evola also. In When I lived in California, I used to go hiking all the time in the hills above Los Angeles. And I don't know if you're familiar with Los Angeles in that area. About 45 minutes north of Los Angeles in Ventura County, there is this small town called Ojai, California. And Ojai, California is a this beautiful idyllic town in basically the Shire. You know, it's in a valley, and it's. Have you ever watched our the second season of True Detective?
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of it is filmed in Ojai, California. You know that weird, creepy pervert house they go to,
Hmm.
and the scenes in the forest. There, that's all Ojai, and that's kind of the
Yeah.
implication. Well, Ojai, California is a place where basically rich Hollywood people go to retire. It's like we're screenwriters and all these guys, and it's a small town. It's they have regulations where there's no chain stores allowed. So there's no supermarkets allowed within city limits that aren't like independently hipster owned. And you'll see like you'll run into like movie stars walking down the street and that type of thing. And you can't rent a place there. It's all, $1 million plus houses and stuff, unless you were kind of grandfathered in. It's great, but it's a beautiful, great place, right?
Hmm.
And they had this wonderful bookstore, and just a huge used bookstore next to like the hippie crystal store, and that type of thing. And my friend and I used to go there all the time. We'd go on a hike through the hills. We'd go get a cup of coffee in Ojai, and then walk to the bookstore and just kind of have conversations. And in their philosophy section of their used bookstore, and this is, like I said, it is very California liberal. They had Fang Numina next to Evola tucked away. So they had like, I think like 4 or 5 Evola books, and Fang Numina there. So I picked them up, and it was the Evola book was one of his weird magician ones, you know. So
Hmm.
I grabbed a copy of those two because I was like, oh, this could be interesting, his ritual magic from Italy. And I picked up Fang Numina, and I walked to the counter, and I went to go buy it. And I've never had like a more dirty look from a guy that, sold me this stuff. I mean, this guy was like, I think he looked into my soul and just like cursed me on the spot. Like I was
Yeah.
like, and I couldn't help myself. I was like, I'm like, oh man, must have been a cool dude that dropped this off. It's kind of weird for a place like this, huh? And I like basically I was like, oh, do you have a restroom I can use? And he's like, no. I'm like, all right, I guess I'll get the fuck out of here, man.
Yeah,
I'm not
that's funny.
welcome. But yeah, I tried reading. I thumbed and read parts of Fang Numina. You're right. I think it needs a lot more it's got a heavy prerequisites. But I do want to. It actually reminded me that I do want to order the Passage Prize book they put out, because I do want to get more into Land. I used to follow him on Twitter, and when he used to post a lot more, and I think he like kind of disappeared off of it or something.
He has a new account. He forgot his old password, but when I did my Dark Enlightenment piece, I thought the same thing you did, that he wasn't on Twitter anymore. But more recently, I found out that nope, he's still alive and well and going.
Like, I log back on X every now and then, and I look at the conversation, and I'm just like, oh, I hate everybody, and I just log off. It's
Yeah.
like,
Well,
it's
the other
just
day, yesterday I got because I don't have it on my phone anymore. I got rid of it on my phone a few weeks ago just because it's so blackpilling. But yesterday I got on and like scrolled for a little bit, and it was actually like white pilling and extremely encouraging. I'm like, holy crap, the discourse is good right now.
oh,
It
I'm gonna
was it was kind of hype.
I'm gonna have to check it out. I did the same thing. I actually removed. So what I did, I had a pretty like decent sized account, and I followed a bunch of people, and a bunch of people followed me back, and I'd get into these great conversations. And then I went on a long trip to Europe, almost 2 years ago, a year ago now, and I decided to like turn it off. I was like, I'm not gonna look at Twitter. I'm not gonna look at Substack. I'm just gonna So I basically deleted Twitter off my phone, and I paused it. And when I came back in such a positive, great mood that I forgot to like up it. And I didn't know that if you don't like log on to it for like certain amount of time, they just like delete it.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, well, I guess, God wills it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I'm not meant to be on here. And I made another one mostly because I talk to people that I want, to be on this podcast, or certain friends that never transitioned over to Substack or haven't really followed over. It's the whole like Twitter Substack beef is really annoying, because I think that they would work well together, and it would really increase like views on both the podcast and the writing and that kind of thing. But
Mhm.
it is what it is, man, right? Whatever they want to do. How about Mark Fisher? Are you a fan of Mark Fisher at all? You read any of his
Uh,
stuff?
yeah, I've read a couple of his books. It's been a long time. I read Capitalist Realism, Ghosts of My Life. One of his other ones. I actually have like there's a big chunky book that's I'm looking at it right now. It's
His
called
entire
Steampunk.
collection, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's his entire. I read that one, and it's just basically every blog post he's ever written in his entire life
yeah.
with
Have you
no
read it? There's a book by one of his students called Egress that's about it was written after Fisher's suicide, and it's kind of about, reflecting on that in light of like being a student and all his philosophy and stuff. It's I read it back in 2020, so it's been a while, but it was pretty good. Um,
No, I have not. I need to actually look into that one. I recently reread, like the other day, just in one sitting. I reread it, the Weird and the Eerie, which I like. And once again, because I'm much more of a literature guy, that piece of his work tended to hit like my interest the most because I like the idea of horror and horror fiction. And I like Fisher because I like how he does his crazy, like, in a way he's like a Substacker before Substack existed. He would, go on these crazy tangents about some TV show he watched as a little kid or like Quartermass, which I've never heard of until I read his stuff. I'm like, some crazy British thing. And that's what I liked about him, and it's kind of a very sad thing that he's not around, so many years later now to kind of comment on the acceleration that's been going on since his untimely suicide.
yeah, yeah, he's a very smart guy, and his writing lives on, thankfully, and a lot of his ideas live on through a lot of people because I think there's a lot for a lot of people to pick up there because he was a lefty guy, but at the same time, his ideas about hauntology I think are really compelling. And I was actually thinking about, when I was doing my Ghost of the Digital Dimension, I was actually thinking about incorporating that, but I didn't end up doing it. Maybe that'll be a part two or something. But yeah, he's got a lot of great ideas.
Right. Well, if to be fair, a lot of the ideas of liminality and stuff are really fed through some of his work. And it was his stuff, the whole idea of hauntology and the dying internet and the different, I don't know if you're familiar with that whole like music scene where the music degrades, that type of thing. Are you familiar with that at all? There was this weird thing back in like 2016 where people were putting out this stuff where it's like found music off the internet that slowly digitally degrades, and it's just like this weird
Interesting.
hauntology thing.
I don't think I know about that. No.
I'm gonna have to post that because like I came across it a while ago and I became obsessed with it, and it I forgot about it because I traveled around a lot and I forgot. But the thing that's what's interesting about our space right now and why I think it's important intellectually to not slip into boomer era politics or MSNBC type politics, because there's a lot of ideas on the left that are interesting, like Mark Fisher, for example. I mean, when
Hmm.
we're reading
Or Baudrillard.
or Baudrillard or Christopher Lasch, right?
Hmm.
And the guy was a leftist himself, and a lot of the critiques of capitalism that these guys have are valid critiques. Um, a lot of our ills today and a lot of the problems we have are due to a neoliberal kind of capitalism and an unrestrained capitalism that tends to be embraced by normie conservatives. And intellectually speaking, if we're going to look at art and philosophy and culture, we have to address some of these topics that people like Mark Fisher addressed, right? Because I don't want to live in a hyper-capitalist world of Chinese plastic crap, right?
Hmm.
And
Right.
that's something that I tend to get into the digital fistfights with some of the more rah-rah kind of types on our side, where it's like, listen, man, I don't want to live in China, okay?
Yeah.
I don't want to be swimming in piles and piles and piles of Starbucks straws. Right.
Right.
I want a world that is beautiful, not covered in plastic. And I don't want to, you see this a lot, and this is going to be a pseudo normie tier discussion, but you get these guys that are selling you like, productivity, be fully productive and you're a man, you work,
Right.
you need to do, and it's like, no, motherfucker, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, like the LinkedIn hustlers.
Yeah, the LinkedIn hustler guys, oh, you got to hustle, man. You got to have 14 different, you got to be maxing your, or whatever. And it's like, listen, dude, I don't want to do that. Okay. I want to chill in my yard and, grow my vegetables and read my books. Okay. And raise a family. I don't want to do that. Okay. Life is not about money, at least to me, and that's kind of why I do tend to have some sympathy towards I would say the alternative left. And then, I do find the Red Scare left pretty interesting, and I've enjoyed, I don't know if you're familiar with those guys or, well, those girls, right?
Yeah.
Their slow movement to the right, because when I started listening to them, they were fully on the left. And I listened to them mostly from a literary kind of perspective because they're on Bret Easton Ellis's podcast, and I really enjoy his stuff. And then they slowly went from being like, straight up leftist to, leftist communist types to, Trump supporters. And I find it pretty hilariously funny. And, they kind of introduced me to Lash, to be honest. I think Anna Ketchian talked about Lash a lot. And I was like, oh, let me pick this up. And I read it and I'm like, hey, I agree.
Yeah, I read the True and Only Heaven earlier this year, which it's pretty hefty, but it was really good, and it introduced me to a lot of interesting thinkers. But yeah, what you're talking about is definitely true. That well, this is really the only space where there's open and interesting dialogue about these kinds of ideas. Because like left-wing theory at this point has degraded so much that even the interesting people from the past, like you know, like a Deleuze or people like that. Like a lot of the post-Marxists have a lot of interesting stuff to say. Not Foucault; he can just go away forever. But like
I agree.
Deleuze, Baudrillard, Lacan, like these are all like super leftist people, but their ideas aren't really getting developed on the left. Well, they're getting developed in a certain way where it's just like we're going to accelerate this into more identity politics and more absurdity, and it's just going to be a bunch of nonsense lingo that they string together to and say like, and this means that you should genderqueer your cat, and you have to do that, and if you're not, you're a colonizer, and that's what it's degraded into. But actually developing these ideas and seeing, okay, how do these push and pull and work with one another? That's only going on in kind of our sphere, which is why there are a lot of people that, are or used to be kind of leftist in a lot of their inclinations or values, but have like joined in this conversation because, this conversation is the only one going on really.
Right. And that's kind of why I've been rather aggressive on Substack notes, and I've been kind of jokingly calling people out. Me and Fisto came up with the no talking about 1933 through 1945 rule.
I've been enjoying that, yeah.
Right? And that's because, not because I don't think that's interesting. I find that entire period fascinating. It's just because it's become Marvel speak in a way for stupid people. And I will shut down people that will go, oh my God, Marxist, 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 and this kind of shit constantly. It's like, stop, you're boring, right? You're dumb. It's just quiet, And in the
Right.
same way, it's like if every conversation, if we can't talk about Lacan or, everything without some idiot interjecting with like, oh, you're a Templar worshiping Marxist or something like that. Or on your other end, if we can't engage with intellectual ideas from the old right or the fascists or any of that stuff without constantly being like, oh, you want to kill everybody, like shut up, man. Like that is not any sort of productive or intellectual conversation. Because listen, as much as we like to talk crazy, a lot of Marx is very interesting, and a lot of Marx ideas on how things worked in his time were valid. And, it's interesting to engage him in that level as opposed to kind of the idiocy. And I think it's even interesting contrasting Marxist ideas with current neoliberal, current lefty like ideas, because they're very different and they're very completely changed or, and I think that even if some lefties today, some normie lefties would engage with some Marxist ideas that they parrot, at least superficially, they would be shocked by how unpalatable they would be to them, and how much more you'd say that they feel more rightish than they imagine,
Yeah.
And at the same time, ultimately, as somebody that grew, I grew up, working class, right? I would say maybe the proper way would be like upper working class, right?
Mhm.
Lower middle class, kind of a downgraded family that we went from being engineers and stuff to being immigrants. I am very sympathetic with the working class, and I've always been an individual that had sympathies towards like punk rock kind of elements and do it yourself and small communities. And I don't I don't want to be under the thrall of some corporate robot in a in Silicon Valley. I don't want to have to use my key card to check in to go on bathroom breaks in my work. I don't want to be
Mhm.
a bug in a giant corporation, no matter how right wing that corporation is. You know what I mean? Uh,
Yeah.
and the world of constant achievement and constant work is just as unattractive to me as what the left puts out. So I do have some, I'd say, working class Marxist sensibilities, which brings me on to kind of the contemporary philosopher Byung-Chul Hall, and I know you're familiar with him. What do you think of him?
Yeah, I think he's great. I've read a ton of his books, not even most of them, I think, because he's cranking out like three a year or something
Yeah,
crazy like that. It's
I,
ridiculous.
I just bought another one the other day. My friend Chris, like, he posted an Instagram picture, and this dude's got like every single one of his books, But I've got The Disappearance of Rituals right here on my desk, and I just bought the political theories one. God, what's it called?
Psychopolitics?
Psychopolitics, right?
Yeah,
And
that's a good one.
I read his main one, the big, his big important one, and I read The Disappearance of Things and Ritual, and he combines, he's hard to place, right? Is he on the left? Is he on the right? I know he's a Catholic, but he does have, he very much is a continuation of Mark Fisher in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and
Yeah, and that Catholic thing was really difficult to figure out because like it wasn't until after I'd read maybe like six of his books and known about him for a while that there was any interview that referenced him being Catholic. And you can kind of get the sense from some of his references,
right.
especially in I think it's in the Palliative Society. He talks a lot about some of the saints, but it's still, yeah, he's really hard to place on the left right spectrum. Like I have no idea.
Right. He's very difficult. And interestingly enough, to go back to our earlier conversation, I actually loan out his books a lot because I find his writing very palatable by normies in a way,
Hmm.
specifically on the topic of work and achievement and that type of thing. And the idea of his like achievement society and being oppressed by our own selves, by our desire to work. And I see that a lot, I see a lot of that. His criticism would match a lot of the guys on our side, supposedly. A lot of
Hmm.
the pimp hustlers we see, and no, you got to work out, you got to max, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do this. When you're sitting in a situation where we've created we're telling young men that they have to be like, Bronze Age pervert buff, like his fake pictures, even though he himself is not buff, right? He's not a super fit guy. And they should be, avoiding all seed oils and, benching 400 and, having all the hoes and all the stuff while also, ingesting the deepest, darkest philosophy available while owning 4 internet businesses, and that does cause a sort of, a disconnection, a spiritual incongruity with I think what our real goals are.
Well, I mean, it really does depend on what your goals are. Like if you're, because like I can give credit to a guy that, does that whole kind of regimen that you've described. It's like if those are your goals to make as much money as possible and like learn about philosophy on the side, like good on you.
Right.
But like but it really depends on what your kind of fundamental values are and what you want to get out of life. And I think that Han has a very good direction for that fits neatly within the Christian tradition, which I'm Catholic, so I was appreciative when I found out that he was Catholic, but what he talks about the contemplative life, and I've done some essays kind of touching on that, as well as I did a 3-part series with the Forest Rebel on Byung-Chul Han, where we talk at extreme length about 2 of his books. Um,
I listened to those actually around the time I was reading them, so I was like, okay, let me listen to these.
Yeah, well, I think that's actually how I discovered your podcast is I
Yeah.
did that and then you commented and then I saw that you had a Byung-Chul Han episode and then I've been listening around since then. Um, but yeah, the contemplative life, or the vita contemplativa, is a very interesting concept, and I think it's really important to because he talks about, like the form of, if you want to call it capitalist or neoliberal exploitation today, is not, it's not the same way that Marx described, even if you think that was true at some point, and it's not, the same type of biopolitical control that Foucault described either. Um, the way you're exploited now is like you're exploited through freedom and like through self-achievement. You become an achievement subject that's constantly trying to self-optimize yourself. And and it's a genius system in that way, because it integrates, any sort of way you try to improve yourself back into itself. You can't really like break out of this system individually, except for by like, you can't break out of it through activity. It's kind of I think there's some kind of a material. Um, I forget what it is, but it's like if you uh, try to, it's some sort of like middle ground between a solid and a liquid, where it's like if you hit it really hard, or here's a better analogy, like Dune and like the books and the movies and stuff.
Right.
And they have those like shields on their body that, and that's,
The Chris knife plasma shields or whatever, right?
yeah, and that's why there's, people, that's why guns aren't really used, because they stop anything that goes too fast, but something that goes through slowly, it gets through. And I think that's a good way of looking at Hans praxis, where it's like if you're really, really active and trying to break out of the system that way, um, it's going to reintegrate you. What you have to do is you have to slow down and you have to engage in contemplation, because that can't be like, contemplation can't be commercialized and like taken up into the system in the same way. I mean, it kind of can. Like we still buy these philosophy books off Amazon and stuff,
Right.
but like contemplation itself, like you you have to do that for yourself, and that means kind of rejecting everything else around what your expectations are. Expectations are in terms of like career and economy, etc. It's very much so relational and meditative and slow, which I think we've really lost.
Right. So I'm gonna kind of go into maybe a little bit of like self-doxing. I spent a lot of time in the military. Okay. I joined the military when I was in college, and I wanted to do it for adventure and excitement, and I kind of stayed around a bit longer than I should have. And one thing you see in those kind of hierarchies is that they're really subsumed by a constant drive towards, I need to get achievement, I need to get promoted, I need to do this. Everybody wanted to, to become, the commander of the facility, or the ship, or the battalion. And that was everybody's fantasy. And for a long time, I guess I kind of fell into that myself, where I was like, yeah, why not? I'm going to do this. I'm going to, freaking become the 4-star general in charge of whatever, right? And after a long time of, kind of a hyper achievement, where I was just doing everything the right way, and kind of grinding at this kind of stuff, I realized that, I'm not really happy, man. This is not what I want to do. And I analyzed these kind of positions and what they do in their day-to-day existence. And I was like, I would be miserable doing this. Like, in a way, you look at people that are into politics a lot, and they're like, oh, I want to be a senator, I want to be a politician. And you have to analyze, do I really want that? Do I really want that lifestyle? Do I really want to be, woken up 24 hours a day, about this kind of stuff. And I did a lot of soul searching. I was like, that's not for me. I don't want to do that. I'd be happier, working at Starbucks than doing that. And sometimes it does, but it's hard. How do you quit that, when you're doing that? Because the second you slow down, then you look like a dirt bag. It's
Right.
are you familiar with like a Japanese salaryman culture?
Yeah.
It's like that. And for listeners, one thing about Japanese salaryman culture, which is their kind of their corporate culture, is that it's very shame oriented, and it's very achievement oriented. And the worst thing you could do is not work, or not show that you're working. So you'll often have an entity, a business entity, a bank, or a, hospital or wherever, and nobody will leave work until the boss leaves work. So you'll have a bunch of guys that finished all their work at 2 in the afternoon, but they'll stay there until 7 or 8 because their boss is doing something. Or even if their boss is just sitting in his office, like smoking a cigarette and like, trolling the internet the whole time, they'll stay there until he gets up because you can't look like the kind of person that's not working, you know?
Right.
And this leads to a kind of a spiritual hole in a lot of, one of the main complaints of Japanese culture is that they work themselves to death. And when I lived in Japan, sadly, I remember that it was a usual occurrence that, a train line would be late or a train would be late because somebody threw themselves in front of a train because they felt like they weren't contributing enough to their corporation or whatever, And I find that completely like, just a symptom or a disease of, hyper neoliberal achievement. And it's interesting that Byung-Chul Hall brings this up, and he himself is Korean, so he's probably has a lot of experience with that.
Yeah,
Because
Korea has a very similar
very
economic
similar,
culture.
right? Very similar culture, of hyper achievement, and that does it make you happy? Are you happy? Do you need to? And that's what I think is his ideas of contemplation is in his Catholicism is really fascinating because I think that is, in a way, I tend to return more and more and more to Samwise Gamgee's Hobbit life, where sometimes you just got to appreciate those potatoes in the pot. You got to slow down. And I don't know. It's rough, especially now that I'm in my early 40s and I'm really contemplating achievements and did I achieve enough? Did everything I do, everything I worked and the hours I spent and the things I've done, are they worth it? Did they bring me happy? Did they bring me closer to God? Did they bring me closer to the spiritual level I want to? And I think that's why I find Byung-Chul Hall so fascinating, and because he really speaks to me on that level,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
go ahead, man.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you go ahead. I didn't have anything.
That's fine. Yeah, I mean it's a podcast. We got to fill the airwaves,
right.
Well, this actually reminds me of the conversation we're having. I want to share a little bit from Schopenhauer, "The World is Will and Representation," because I think it's extremely poignant to what we're talking about. And I was actually reading this earlier today, and this is from chapter/section 57 of volume 1, where he has that famous line that like well, I'll say it exactly if I actually it's not worth finding right now, but that famous line that's something along the lines of like life is an oscillation between suffering and boredom, and as soon as you're not suffering, you're bored, and as soon as you're um so once we've kind of taken care of the base needs we go into this boredom, and then we're constantly like chasing some sort of way to stimulate ourselves and be happy and all that, which is he would think it's a nightmare seeing today's smartphone society, saying is that he was talking about this back in the 1800s where
Right.
I don't even know how people entertained themselves back then, but somebody from today, if you took them back there, they'd probably like have a mental breakdown with how understimulated they are. But anyway, he kind of lays this out, and then he's like, and yeah, I know this is extremely depressing, but here's some other ideas that might make you feel a little bit better. And there's a bit about stoicism and kind of taking a stoic outlook towards suffering and pleasure. But he has this one line. It's quote, "What might otherwise be called the finest part of life, its purest joy, just because it lifts us out of real existence and transforms us into disinterested spectators of it, is pure knowledge, which remains foreign to all willing pleasure in the beautiful, genuine delight in the art." And so he talks about how, like one of it's very similar to what Han talks about with the Vita Contemplativa, which I think Han directly cites Saint Thomas Aquinas, who also talks about how that's one of the uh, best experiences you can have, the best things you can do. And the ancient Greeks also touched on that a lot with the concept of eudaimonia, of pursuing philosophy to reach this state of kind of it's not exactly happiness, but satisfaction. Or no, but it's not even satisfaction, but just like this like touching of like the purest ideas and like the purest knowledge.
Right.
But he also says, Schopenhauer says, then again, higher intellectual power makes those very few susceptible to much greater sufferings than duller men can ever feel. So it's like it kind of comes with a trade-off, like because you're able um to kind of touch on this like because you can deal with like these philosophical ideas. It's kind of you have to endure the suffering of like, oh, you're gonna die without knowing most of philosophy, and that's just the way it is. Or at the same time, um, you're recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. And then bear with me because there's one other short passage from this section I wanted to read. That's from the very end of the section. Um, where Schopenhauer says, "For we untiringly strive from desire to desire, and although every attained satisfaction, however much it promised, does not really satisfy us, but often stands before us as a mortifying error, we still do not see that we are drawing water with the vessel of the De Danaides, and we hasten to ever fresh desires." So that really echoes Lacan there of like in our kind of base pursuit of escaping boredom. um, the desire for something is much more uh, scintillating than actually getting something.
Right.
And that's what dopamine is. Like dopamine is a pleasure chemical of anticipation,
Right.
sometimes of achievement, but mostly of anticipation. So that's why if you like, that's why people become shopping addicts because it's not like the things themselves that they're addicted to. It's the process of ordering something online and waiting for it to show up. That's the addictive part because it's the desire and like the anticipation is much more pleasurable than the thing itself.
Well, absolutely. And in my early 20s or mid 20s, I used to do a lot of bar hopping and woman chasing. And I look back on that time in my life, and it wasn't the post bar that I enjoyed. It wasn't the going home with the person or whatever, right? It was I loved the drive out there. I remember I'm going to LA this Friday night, and there was nothing better than driving with my friends and like, okay, this is going to be fun. We're going to meet a lot of interesting people, and it's going to be a new, environment and a new anticipatory thing. Like, will I meet some interesting girl? Will I not? And then when you do, you're like, oh, it's whatever. It's like it's
Right.
kind of like anticlimactic in a way, because that wasn't the enjoyable part. It was the novelty part that was exciting, and that can become addictive. And you know sometimes how Schopenhauer talked about sorrow or the kind of the downside of it. Sometimes it makes me think that do we being sorrowful is being hurt sometimes preferable to being numb, right? Because so much in our society is built around this idea of not experiencing any discomfort or pain, whether it's emotional and mental with our predisposition or predominance of antidepressants and SSRIs, or just our complete aversion towards creating any sort of scary environment. And sometimes, like, you see this in like, literary culture or any type of gamer kind of culture where it's like, you got like trigger warnings and red flags and things I don't want to talk about and that kind of stuff. And sometimes I find myself, I want to be sad,
Yeah.
I would rather fail and be disappointed and heartbroken than completely not ever feel anything at all. You know, I it's a very, in a way, it's a very Sisyphean, Camus type of concept of I'd rather be pushing the rock up the hill knowing very well that it's going to roll back down the next day than just not be pushing it at all.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and we live in a world. I've joked on the podcast, and I've joked with my friend. It's kind of something we used to joke about when we used to go hiking. How if all those guys from the 19th century, 19th, 18th centuries, people, guys like Schopenhauer and stuff, and the existentialists like Dostoevsky lived today, they'd be fucked, man. I mean, you had these guys like they'd come across one bit of adversity, and they became like gamblers with brain fever. But if you
Yeah.
if you handed Dostoevsky Twitter and Substack,
Yeah.
he'd lose his mind,
Well,
like.
he'd be on like DraftKings like
Yeah,
instantly.
exactly. He'd be on DraftKings. He would never write one freaking book. Those guys
Hmm.
couldn't handle living in the modern world. So in a way, we have it harder than these philosophers of the past because we have the constant, yeah, there was the gulag that he got sent to, but ultimately the gulag at least allowed him to think about Christ. And in our world, you can't even think.
Right. It's there's everything's always demanding your attention.
Right.
And yeah, the well, Han talks a lot about, that we have an overly positive society, that there's like enforced positivity on everything. But negativity is really important too, because I think he talks about this in the palliative society, um, which I think that was kind of coming out of like just post-COVID that he was writing that, or like maybe 2021. If it was after COVID had started, um, where he was talking about, okay, like we've just gotten down to this like base survival instinct, of just like, oh yeah, maintain life, and like uh, not really willing to face the sufferings that come along with life, and deal with those. But he emphasizes how negativity is extremely important for uh, anything creative, for one, but just for like having like the fullness of human experience and like a healthy psychology. Like you need to be willing to deal with negative things, because negative things exist. Like you can't escape them, and that's the lesson from tragic art and literature in general, is that okay, these negative things exist and they are going to get into your life. Like that's going to happen no matter what.
Right.
But that's the tragic art is some of the most beautiful and most gripping art, because it gets to some of the most fundamental aspects of human existence, that if we don't have those, we we aren't we aren't having the fullness of the human experience.
Right. You're not human without the sacrifice and the pain.
Hmm.
You need the friction of the universe to, really become something outside of just a pleasure bot, a pleasure machine. And everything in our society is geared towards creating kind of a Wall-E level pleasure world, and it's terrifying in a way because like how do you fight a positive? You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
how do you convince people to not be comfortable? Hey man, don't be comfortable, Don't be happy, right?
right.
And it's hard, and it is a monumental task in a way, in the same like how you described the Dune knife thing. It's like how do you convince people to, turn up the temperature a little bit, or come join you in a tougher kind of thing, because there's much more fulfillment and achievement if you
Yeah.
if you try harder.
Yeah,
Um,
it's not so much like don't be happy, but like there is a greater happiness waiting for you around the corner, which is also a very Christian idea, that it's not like we're telling you your desires are bad and like they shouldn't be fulfilled. No, we're telling you that like there is a greater fulfillment of your desires.
right, absolutely. And you just mentioned art, and ultimately this podcast is about books and entertainment and art. And what kind of what you know I hate this word. I'm going to say, what kind of media do you enjoy? Like, whether it's television shows, movies, what kind of stuff do you find recently that kind of touches on these topics that you're interested in, that really you think is worthwhile pursuing in our giant, like, overwrought, oversaturated space?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in regards to, most of the easy to consume content like TV and video games, regardless of the content that's in them. I mean, I'm very much so a McLuhan enjoyer. Like the medium is the message. The message you're kind of getting from these in general is it follows the logic of the society we live in. But
Right.
at the same time, I think that despite that, valuable messages can seep through, Um, but that touches on this subject specifically, I don't know if I really, I'm drawing a blank. Um,
Well, what kind of stuff do you enjoy? Well, obviously you enjoyed what do you call it? What's was it? Breaking Bad. You know
oh
enough
yeah,
to
yeah,
you know, and that's a golden golden age of television, golden age of era where you had your fantastic multi-seasonal tragedies. I think that
yeah,
era of television has kind of came to an end recently,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Well,
You know,
there's a I to add to your point, I think there's a very interesting parallel that we can draw between Breaking Bad and The Walking Dead because they're both AMC shows. They both started around the same time. And one is like remembered as universally by most people like one of the greatest TV shows of all time, and the other one is probably going to fade into obscurity. Um, which I think they're both like enjoyable shows, but I think that holding them up next to each other is a very interesting thing because Breaking Bad like closes the narrative and provides like a cohesive narrative, and then it started a new narrative with Better Call Saul, but it closes that too. Like it tells a story, but with
right.
so many TV shows these days, there's a temptation that like, oh, this is a cash cow. We just got to keep milking this and milking this, like the Marvel type stuff, which is what happened with The Walking Dead. Like the seasons just kept going on and on and on and on. And
I tapped out. By the way, I liked the first season a lot, and I tapped out in the second season when they killed Shane, and I was like, I don't want to watch anymore.
yeah, yeah.
That's
I
when I
mean,
tapped out. That was the moment I was like, I like Shane, and he was the guy that he was right. I don't know, he was right about everything. So once he tapped, he was gone. I was like, I hate the show now.
yeah. I mean, I won't get too spoilery because even though it's like a closed show, but like there was a character that was like out of the show but wasn't dead. But like you know, so season 11 was the last season. Like the show is concluded now, but now there's all these like spin-off shows. Like there's the Walking Dead cinematic universe, like it's Marvel or something.
Oh, I hate that.
And like yeah, it sucks, but a beloved character by many fans, and a lot of people will that have seen the show, or at least most of the show will know what I'm talking about. But like disappears in one of the seasons, doesn't die, but just like goes away. And like I heard that like they teased that like in the last episode, the final episode of the main series, he's like gonna come back. And I'm like, oh, fine, I guess I'll finish it because like this character is coming back. And in like season 11 of The Walking Dead is like the worst television that's ever been created. It's just like so creatively bankrupt and boring, and it's just terrible. And then you get to the last episode, and I'm like waiting, and I'm like okay, this is like a really sucky ending, but it's like a post credit scene where this character comes back in the form of pretty much a teaser for one of the spin-off TV shows. And I'm like,
Um,
are you
I
kidding me right now? It's just like another ad for another spin-off show, which
What
is
a hideously
unbelievable.
monstrous thing to do. Actually, I'm going to disagree with you. I think that the worst television show of all time, and the worst season, is season 4 of True Detective that just aired.
Oh, I haven't even bothered.
Oh, don't even. I I don't hate watch. Look, I don't hate watch stuff. I know what I like and I know what I don't like, right? And for
Hmm.
example, Star Wars. Okay, growing up, I like Star Wars. Everybody likes Star Wars, right? You're like, hey,
Hmm.
Star Wars is cool. And I remember I believe in high school when The Phantom Menace came out and all the hype around it and all that. And I remember taking my little brother who was like, I don't know, fourth grade at that time. And we went and saw it and I was like, man, I fucking hate this. This is stupid. Right. So I've
Yeah.
never seen anything past The Phantom Menace. I was like, don't like, I finished Star Wars then and there. I was done with it. I'm like, I'm not going to even bother with it. So I haven't watched any of the new ones. I don't care. I've not watched any of the Disney stuff for Star Wars. I think I watched 1 or 2 episodes of the Mandalorian in passing, and I was like, yeah, it looks kind of crappy. It's like just a rehash of old cowboy movies for like a new generation, but dumber.
Hmm.
I don't follow any of that. I've never been a Marvel guy because I've just never really liked the idea of superheroes. Even as a little kid, I was like, I'm not really a big superhero guy. The only superhero movie I like, and people are going to hate on me for this, is The Watchmen. I like Snyder's
It's a
Watchmen.
good movie. It's a good movie.
I thought it was good, and I tended to like, if I read comic books, it was like the Vertigo stuff, like Sandman and Fables and some of the other stuff. But I think I've seen like one X-Men movie and the first Avengers maybe, and maybe the first Iron Man. It just never it never did it for me. I was like, whatever. If it's on TV and people are watching, I'll sit down and kind of watch it. I think one of the worst movies I've ever seen was Wonder Woman 2 or whatever. I was stuck watching that and I was so freaking pissed off watching that. I was like, this is so bad. Like the one that's set in the 80s or whatever. I was like, this is so bad.
Yeah.
That was bad. But yeah, True Detective season 4, I tried to watch because I love season 1. I like season 2. I like season 3.
I stopped after season 2. I heard season 3 was bad, so I didn't even try it.
You know what? It's all debatable, right? I think that season 2 and 3 are not as good as season 1. I think
Hmm.
there was like a level of magic that was captured in that production of season 1
Yeah,
that
season 1 is incredible.
right. I mean, it's still by far one of my favorite television shows of all time, and I think I don't really rewatch a lot of stuff, but I've watched it numerous times. But he wasn't going to recreate that. The director split after the first season, and HBO got his tendrils into it. But they kicked him off the show. They kicked off the show creator off the show after season 3, and they replaced him with some kind of feminist woke thing. And season 4 missed on every category, from acting to the setting to plot to theme. It was such a poor pastiche of the previous seasons. And meanwhile, season 3 was a slower kind of contemplative kind of idea. It dealt with memory and Alzheimer's and a lot of I think over the years, people are going to watch it and they're going to re-examine it and reassess it, in my opinion, because there was a lot of very intelligent things dealing with the nature of obsession with work and basically sacrificing everything for kind of an obsession with this case that this character has. And it really dealt, there was some like race relation stuff that it did really, really well. It did it really smart to where it had a African American lead detective and a white like kind of secondary partner. And they did a very interesting thing where they flipped the roles, where usually the African American detective tends to be like the more pleasant, friendly kind of nice guy, and kind of like the foil to the grim, dark kind of white lead detective, the Russ Cole kind of character. And season 3 kind of flipped it to where the white partner was the nice guy that was doing everything like out of friendship and friendliness, and the kind of crusty, angry black detective kind of shat on him for all that stuff. And in the end, the white guy stuck by him and backed him up all the way to the end because he was truly a friend. And I thought that was really interesting in kind of the very anti-stereotypical milieu of like police shows. And so I liked season 3 a lot, and I think it's worth
Yeah.
watching. And it left a lot of people. The ending is very ambiguous, but it's about Alzheimer's, right?
Yeah.
And of course, it's ambiguous. It's about memory. It's about these characters that are remembering things completely different than they really happened, and how they're approaching that. It's very Mark Fisher-ish in a way, when the way they're
Yeah.
approaching it. And I think that when people are going to go back and rewatch it, it's going to go up in esteem over the years. And that's my personal opinion. What I watched recently? I caught actually in theaters that I really liked was the oh my, what's the robot movie I just saw with my kid? The Wild Robot. Are you
The Wild
familiar?
Robot. No, this is a new movie?
It's a brand new movie. It's a DreamWorks movie. It's made by the same team that did the latest like Puss in Boots movie, which a lot of people liked, and I enjoyed it. But
Hmm.
it's a robot movie, like an animated, digital animated, but made to look like Japanese Miyazaki films, right? Um,
Yeah.
and I saw it on Saturday night, and we went to the theaters because I take my daughter. She loves going to the theater. She's 6 years old, and she's just a movie person. And I sat through it, and I was like just amazed by how interesting it was. Like philosophically, if that makes sense. And it's about a robot. And it's not a spoiler because it's not a complex plot or anything like that.
Yeah.
You've got this like kind of weird futuristic world. That's the implication, kind of this Wall-E world, right? And this robot washes ashore, like a ship, like an airship or something like that, kind of crash lands, and it's delivering it's like an Amazon drone ship basically, right? Like an Apple Amazon drone ship, and it's delivering these like worker robots, these like robots meant to they're like household servants. They're people buy them and they're programmed to help you out. They're kind of your comfort robot, right? And the ship crashes on this like remote like forested island, and all the robots kind of wash up and they die. They're destroyed except for one. And this robot is accidentally activated by an animal, and it's walking around. It has no purpose. It keeps on walking up to animals, going like, "What can I do for you?" Blah blah blah. Because it's been programmed to serve, to be a servant to people, and it has no purpose, right? And it eventually learns how to speak animal basically, and kind of like it kind of like kills. It's a really dark movie, right? It gets chased by a bear and it falls onto a nest and kills all these geese,
Oh
right?
my goodness.
And crushes all the eggs except for one. And
Wow.
one egg hatches, and now it's got this little gosling that's like a total runt, and it doesn't know what to do with it, right? And it kind of imprints on itself that it needs to be its mom. So it's basically its purpose is to become a mom in a really well done way. And there's this scene where it's finding its purpose, where the robot walks to this like wall, and it's covered in butterflies, and it's this very beautiful, well rendered scene. And then it touches the butterflies and they all fly everywhere, and it's this insane. And it's a straight out of a Mircea Eliade's like Sacred and the Profane. It has like a spiritual awakening. It's like what do you call it? Like the numinous basically breaks into this robot's ability, and it starts to become part of the environment as opposed to being an alien in it. And the robot decides to activate its beacon and kind of call home and go home, right? Because it's kind of having like a moment of like doubt in its thing. And she goes to the top of this mountain and she turns on the beacon, which is on top of her head, and lightning hits it and breaks the beacon. And it allows the robot to rewrite itself. And it's like, I'm like, these guys just do a divine intervention moment on a kid's movie,
Yeah.
Because it found purpose through lightning and through like these I thought it was this perfect movie. But what's crazy, and I'm going to rant about a kid's movie for another few minutes, right? A bunch of stuff happened eventually, and it's when you go watch a movie in current day, right? Your first thought is like, oh god, it's going to be a Disney thing and it's going to have some woke shit in it, and I'm going to have to explain to my daughter all this stuff, and it's going to piss me off, like I turn into that chud brain guy, because if you're in our side of the world, you're always aware of this stuff. You're like, okay, I gotta be aware of the message hidden behind, right? So when you catch a movie that is completely the opposite, and the messages that are hidden into it are actually like your messages, you're like, oh, hey, holy crap, and there's the robot becomes a surrogate mother kind of. But what I loved about it is that when it's getting this goose to go and, fly south or whatever, right? That's kind of the goal. It doesn't teach it how to fly or how to do everything by herself. She actually gets the male role model goose to do it. Right? It gives him confidence. She gives him confidence as a mom, but it's a father figure that steps in and takes the goose there.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, is that a movie made in 2024? I'm like, what?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they brought in an older male figure to lead, and take him under his wing, which was the right thing to do, which is very like, a very right wing kind of, idea, right? A very, the idea of the different roles and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I thought that was like really, I guess, it's like really shocking in 2024 mainstream kids television or movies, and I found that very interesting. I want more people to watch this movie when it comes out on like streaming, because there's a lot of themes to it that are right up the kind of stuff we talk about a lot in it. And I didn't expect that. I went in knowing nothing at all, and I was like, oh, well shit, even to the point where eventually the beacon comes out, and there's a really cool like Dante's Inferno kind of scene where she finds a cave, and in the cave is like the remains of all the old robots. She kind of descends into like Hades. It's all the rusted robots that didn't make it off the ship, and she kind of like activates one, fixes one, and this thing is like a demon. It's covered in like barnacles and stuff because it's been in the water, and it tells her like, oh, you're malfunctioned, you're a failure, you're not serving, you're not doing anything, right? Even though she's been helping all these animals out, it's like this thing is like brings doubt into her life. She gets the beacon and ends up kind of having a fail moment and summons like the corporation to come pick her up. And the character that comes to pick her up is this like Cthulhu-esque monstrosity with like tentacles and stuff. It's basically like the thing. I don't know if you ever played Portal, like that floating thing in Portal. It's that, but with tentacles in it, and it's got Kamala Harris voice, right? It's like HR voice. It even has this like laugh that it interjects every few minutes, and you're like, oh, this is disgusting. I hate this thing, right? And it's like, oh. She goes, don't worry about my voice. I sound very jolly and cheery, but I have no feelings about anything. And we're going to deactivate you because blah, blah, blah. And it's this crazy, insane thing. I'm like, what? Did they just do this? Like it was like this HR lady monstrosity came to like take away the mom from the goose,
Yeah.
and to make it back into a servant for people. And it was such a, like, I don't know. It's a great movie. I highly recommend it, even though it's a kid's movie. I felt that it was really touching. But I think that there is a lot of media there. And I think that in a way, what we, I guess, what I find interesting is that we do need to analyze media from our own perspective, because it's been dominated by the wrong perspective for a long time, or an uninteresting perspective. And also we need to create media and that's how we do break into, those conversations like we were having earlier. You're not going to give them Evola, but you're going to talk to them about the wild robot and some of the themes behind it and why they're interesting,
Yeah. Well, art and literature are like great avenues for that I didn't even, because earlier we were only really talking in terms of the, the ideas in the books, but yeah, art and literature are a great pathway for, but yet stories in general. And this is something I keep thinking about a lot of, I have an older piece. It was one of the first like kind of like standalone essays I did that wasn't part of my Spangler series, but it was called Reckoning with Truth and Myth. And it's, mostly an incomplete thought that I'm still kind of working on, but it's like stories are kind of like a zip file, like you can't like email like a, multi-gigabyte file, but like a story is like compressing the file, and like, so you can put it into the email or something like that. It makes it easier for things to like pass through the mental barriers and the themes in there. Which is why our enemies have used it for so long as such an effective tool of propaganda and destruction.
Right, absolutely.
But I think that's failing because they've put ideology above art, and ideology and themes are different things. But so it's very encouraging to hear that there's like a kids movie out there with the good themes that came out this year. That's crazy.
Right. And I think that in my opinion, as a writer, and that's what, if I am remembered for anything, I hope that I'm remembered as a writer. And I think that the goal of any artist or anybody that, whether you're a musician, a nonfiction writer, anything like that, is the goal is truth, right? And for example, you and I, who are, you said you're a Catholic, I'm also, I'm Orthodox because I was born in Eastern Europe, right? But our fundamental like operating system accepts the fact that there is truth in the world, in the universe. Like we are not in the relative world. There is actual truth. We might not fully understand it. We might not be able to fully articulate it, but I think that art itself is not just a mere product, just a mere like candy for consumption, right? That it is to attain real art, or is that you kind of like tap into a spiritual truth, right?
Hmm.
And what I've noticed is, and you kind of tap onto in your kind of short, quick essay about Starfield, right?
Yeah.
Where you talk about how like they it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's not truthful, and it's not. And just for the listeners that are not familiar with what Dr. Monzo wrote in that one, what Mason did, is he mentions that in Starfield, the way the characters look and their accents don't make any sense, right? And for example, they'll have, they're supposed to be, people 300, 400 years away from Earth, but they've held on to racial and cultural elements that make no sense to hold on to, like African, like Kenyan accents,
Yeah,
and
it was especially the accents that got me because you
right,
think about how accents work. It's like the dialect of the people you're around, but when everybody's kind of been mixed together, it's like how are there still racial distinctions? Like that implies everybody's kind of racist if like the races still exist, but like there's no nations anymore, you know?
right, and I only played Starfield for a little bit, and I didn't like it. I actually found it kind of dull, and I didn't enjoy the game itself as a game, so I moved on from it. But you can contrast it to Cyberpunk 2077, which I will bring up in every freaking podcast I do because I love that game.
Yeah,
And
don't spoil it for me though, because I haven't finished it.
okay, I won't. But in that game, you do have very distinct cultural race elements in that game, whether it's the Japanese culture or the interesting kind of like voodoo neuromancer type guys running around, and the Hispanic kind of Latino church guys. And they all make sense within that world because they are at the same time uh, very familiar to us culturally, but also they are progressed in the actual world, to where the Catholicism that the kind of Catholic kind of crowd, the Hispanic ones in Los Angeles, because Night City is Los Angeles. It's supposed to be Los
Hmm.
Angeles-ish, right? And it makes sense that there's a huge Catholic Hispanic population there. They're completely, Cyberpunk 2077. They've completely adopted and adapted a lot of the more modern kind of cultural elements of America and American culture through that cyberpunk lens. But you see the same thing with the Haitians. That there's a lot of Haitians
Hmm.
in kind of Jamaicans in that game, and they're all a huge mix of the cyberpunk slang and everything mixed with some of the voodoo stuff that makes sense that they would adopt in that world.
Hmm.
It all makes sense within the world, right? And you
Yeah.
see that with the Japanese characters. They're Japanese through a very cyberpunk American lens. They've adopted a lot of Western elements to their businesses and that kind of stuff, but at the same time, they've kept these like pseudo traditions mixed with their kind of cyberpunk kind of concepts, which Starfield completely failed to do. And you see
Yeah.
that in a lot of like kind of ham-handed media and entertainment. You see that a lot in like Dungeons and Dragons. And I mentioned that because people like to talk about it. I haven't played Dungeons and Dragons in like 2 decades. But you have like the kitchen sink world where you have a bunch of guys, and I tried Baldur's Gate and it irritated me because of this. It just the world feels fake. It
Hmm.
feels like the internet in a way
Yeah.
where there's no real culture to it. It's just a mix of individual, like just everything's tossed
Yeah.
into a chat room. You got like the guy with the horns and blah blah blah, and you got the black elf and the Asian human, and then you've got the white hobbit or whatever, and it's just like what planet do these guys live in that
Right.
who are their children? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
How do they pass culture? How do they have this culture? It's like almost like day one of their culture forever. It's just day one forever.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's like the problem with like DEI or wokeness. It's not diversity itself because it's that there's diversity in a way that it makes no sense in the context of the story. Because you can tell what they were trying to do with Starfield, where they were like showing off like all of humanity is off in the stars. But in the context of the story, it does not make any sense how within a completely diverse society, people would have the exact same accents that like their ancestors from 300 years ago had on Earth. Because in America today, like probably everybody knows a second generation immigrant from anywhere where, their parents have a super strong accent from whatever country they're from, and the
Right.
kid has just the accent of whatever part of America they're in now.
Hello, nice to meet you. I was born in Bucharest, Romania, and nobody could tell that I was born anywhere else but Long Beach, California.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. So it's like you scale that over 300 years and somehow people retain their extremely specific regional accents. Like, come on.
It's
And like, yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah. And that's the problem with wokeness. Like it's not that there's like an issue with there being diverse characters because like you said with cyberpunk, it's like this is based on a certain part of the world where all these people do exist, so it makes sense that they would all be here. Whereas with like excuse me, with the Lord of the Rings, the new ones with Amazon that I haven't watched, but it's
I,
you're kind of just like shoehorning this into here, whereas Tolkien based that entire world off of the English countryside in the Middle Ages, where
right.
it was all English, so
Right. And I've been fortunate enough to to be able to do a lot of travel. And, people are like, oh, I had some guy accuse me of being some traveled aristocrat or whatever because I'm so rich. I'm like, dude, come on, man. Like, it doesn't cost a lot of money to travel. A ticket to Rome. In this argument I had on Substack where this guy called me like some kind of effete, like rich guy. It's like, bro, you can get a ticket from Savannah, Georgia to Florence, Italy for $500 round trip. All right. That's like
yeah.
ultimately nothing if you really wanted to do. I've had friends when I was in my 20s that were completely broke, lived on couches, and they would save all their money just so they could go travel every few months and see the world. So
Hmm.
that's, you just got to put your priorities where your priorities are, right? And I managed to do a lot of traveling, not as much as I want to, but I've traveled all over the place. I've been all over Asia, and I've been a lot of places in Europe. And also, when I was in the military, I did a lot of traveling that way, but not to any cool places, right? It's always
Yeah.
the fucking Kyrgyzstan or something like that. Interesting places, but not vacation stuff, right? But
Yeah.
what I noticed, and to a degree, a sadness of it is that the what makes travel interesting and what makes different cultures interesting is that they're different, right? I like Tokyo because it's Tokyo and it's Japanese. You know, I like Seoul because it's Korean. It's different than Tokyo. One of my favorite places I've been to is Taipei in Taiwan, the capital of Taiwan, and it's amazing because it's not Tokyo, it's not Seoul, it's Taipei, and the Taiwanese are Taiwanese. It's very different than Hong Kong, which is very close to it. And I also spent some time there, and that's a very unique city itself. And you have these interesting cultures, and that's what makes it interesting. Unfortunately, so many places in the world have become non-places, right? And I think maybe that's a Mark Fisher idea, right? Of non-place. And what he talks about is that they become airports. You go to downtown Tokyo and you take away some of the Japanese, the kanji writing and some of the crazy anime 3D crap that's everywhere. And it's no different than Times Square because you're going to have a Gap store, a Banana Republic, you're going to have a Gucci bag store, and it's a fucking mall. Right.
Hmm.
And then you go to Seoul and it's the same thing. And both places you have a Starbucks where you can get a cappuccino that tastes identical to each other. I was in a few years ago, I found myself in Borneo, right? In the city of Kuching, right? In Malaysia. And this is a place that is completely like, it's out fucking there. Nobody goes there, right? And in Kuching, guess what they had in the mall across from my hotel room? Gucci store, Gap, KFC, and a Starbucks. And it all tasted exactly the same, right? So I'm in a place where they just like gave up, headhunting and cannibalism 50 years ago, supposedly, right? And these guys are, at the Gucci store with their Starbucks, frappuccinos in their hands. And I'm like, well, this sucks. You know, I
Yeah.
don't want that, right? That's the world that the die guys want. You know, they don't want diversity. They want bland neo capitalism, basically, and that's
Hmm.
what we're gonna get. We're gonna get this Starfield blandness where it's that boring gray color, and even space itself is boring.
Yeah.
You know, and it sucks. And you do want the cyberpunk world in a way, right? Because it's gross and it's nasty and it's got like death and misery, but at least it feels like something.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a more accurate description of what, a world like that would look like, even though it is like like if you want to talk like hyper capitalist and all that, it
Right,
is,
right,
it's that like turned up to 11 out of 10, but
right,
it's a very genuine, display of a setting.
right. In a way, do you want to live in the world of cyberpunk, or do you want to live in the world of Demolition Man? You know, if you're familiar with that movie.
I haven't seen it, no.
Demolition Man is great. I'm not going to go into it, but it's worth watching. But, the Starfield world, the bland Star Trek Federation, where everybody's wearing the same jumpsuit and everything's awesome, and you can go to the replicator and it's going to fart out food and it's going to be fantastic, you know?
Right.
And I don't know. I would rather risk getting my cyberware pulled out by crazy tweakers, in a bathtub,
Yeah.
than live in a Star Trek world of freaking jumpsuits
Mhm.
and bland computer voices.
Well, that circles back to Han too, with the idea of the excess of positivity, where oh, we've constructed this kind of like semi-socialist utopia, or like everything's kind of this bland uniformity, um, and it lacks any sort of negativity. Like you're going to get negativity in cyberpunk. It's there,
Right, right.
but it adds so much flavor to the world.
It adds romance. It adds,
Yeah.
a level of, if you have nothing to strive for, nothing, no adversity, it's a world devoid of romance. It's a frozen world, right? It's a world that has nothing to offer because nothing's worth, doing. And you
Hmm.
just sit down and you're like, well, I'm just going to sit down and die because this is boring, you know?
Yeah. But
Um,
cyberpunk, I feel like the story is extremely Faustian, where V is like, I'm gonna make something of myself, and like that's kind of the impetus that kicks everything off in the
Right.
story.
I
Like,
mean, the trigger is that first fixer. He goes, how are you going to go out? You going to go out in
yeah,
a blaze of glory to be remembered, or are you gonna sell out and become a nobody?
right.
And I'm not going to spoil it, but all the endings are interesting. They're all. I think it's probably a masterpiece of a game when it comes to its writing and the way it ends. It's you know, there's like 8 different endings, but they're all great. You
Yeah.
can
Well,
knock
and
them.
I've heard that Phantom Liberty also completely does different endings.
Yeah, it
So
adds 2 endings, and they're similar. Phantom Liberty kind of irritates me in a way, but that's for a different reason. It kind of adds a thriller element to the game, and it's smart the way it's done, but it's irritating to me. But I don't want to spoil it.
yeah.
Um, but we've talked for about 2 hours, man. It was a wonderful conversation. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we go?
No, that's all. Thanks so much for having me on.
No, absolutely, man. And look, keep doing what you're doing, man. Keep doing the writing because like that, I think we're making in a small way, we are making people think, and you are making people think. You're making me think. You're making me look into things. And before you go, is there one book you'd recommend listeners read right now that you find interesting? That's kind of like your recommendation. I like that. I like to ask people that before they go.
Yeah, I think if I had one book recommendation, I think I would do Psychopolitics by Han. I think that was a big paradigm shifting book for me, and I think that the ideas in there are super interesting.
All right. Well, I've got that sitting on my desk behind me, so that's freaking. I'm going to start that probably tomorrow night when I finish the current novel I'm reading.
Perfect.
All right, man. And hey, you're always welcome back. And it was a wonderful conversation. We went on a little bit of tangents, but not too many this time,
No,
which
that
is
was fun.
good, right?
Yeah,
And I hope you come back on. You're always welcome, and I hope we interact a lot more. And I hope that all the listeners enjoyed it. And if you did, please comment on the episode post and comment on YouTube, like it on YouTube, Spotify, all that stuff, because It ultimately, it doesn't make me any money or anything like that, but it ultimately gets the word out and it gets us in the algorithms so the machine gods can spread our ideas far and wide. Because ultimately, when we all get subsumed into the machine, I want my viral ideas to break it. All right, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to
Hmm.
create critical mass of our ideas, and when the AI basically copy our brains, like they did in Cyberpunk to what's his name, to Johnny Silverhands, I want to be the fucker that ruins the programming. All right, from the inside. All right, that's the way we're gonna fight it, guys. All right, we're gonna be a mind virus on these people. Okay, and if you've looked at the last 5, 10 years of like social commentary, it has been a mind virus. Okay, you see changes every day. The fact that a 21-year-old talks to me about Evola is the fact that our mind virus is latching on to the ideas. All right,
Yeah.
so keep it up, man. All right, good
Yeah.
night,
Thanks.
guys.
You too.
Talk to you guys soon. Have a good night.